Hi everyone, some more guitar stuff to show you. Because of this COVID-19 problem we've had around the world at the moment, I found myself with a lot of time on my hands, so I decided to have a go at a few projects. I was able to complete one that was already on the go, and a couple of fresh ones were taken on just for a bit of fun, with the understanding that I didn't have to leave the house to be actually, to get any of the materials or anything for this. Online stuff was available, but for the most part what I wanted to do was to build some instruments without actually leaving the house at all, to try and get hold of bits and pieces. But first off, I want to talk about this. This was a Bronze Series BC Rich Warlock, which I purposely bought because it was in such poor condition. Now the main thing for me was that I wanted to get hold of something that needed a bit more work than I'd been used to in respect to correcting errors on guitars and wear and tear and damage. If you get a good instrument to start with, you can always make it better, easier, that's fine, but to extend my own skills and abilities, I thought I'd want to get something that was a bit more desperate, and I certainly got that. The Bronze Series don't have a good rep. It's an odd instrument, very, very odd. But as you can see in this one, it's in a picture of the headstock. This fluff and dust that was on it was absolutely everywhere. This image of the top of the neck, these were all taken quickly as soon as I got the instrument back into the house, and I was not about to leave it like it for very long, so I just dashed them off on the phone. Top of the neck, fluff, seriously wet at some point. This maybe sweat, love to think that it was somebody sweating on stage using this thing, but probably beer spills. Not good, but in a bad place. And the bridge in particular had some quite serious corrosion on it, and what we think are these fibres, we think are cat hairs, something like that. It's been sat behind the sofa for some years, I would imagine. After I'd given it nothing more than a clean, this is what I had. Lots of problems hidden under this. The bridge was corroded, as I mentioned. There was quite a lot of pitting on it, and the posts for it, as they sat into the body, had just levered their way towards the neck, because this is basswood. I don't think that kind of wood's really strong enough for these wraparound bridges that take all of the string tension straight through the posts. Pickups were in around the wrong way, and the surrounds for some reason were around the wrong way. The bridge was in the correct position, but the narrower end of it was at the bridge side, and the neck was the same, ran the wrong way. Fingerboard was quite a nice piece of wood, but up at the nut somebody had put a Stratocaster style nut resting on top of some piece of plastic, and it looks like there'd been an attempt to super glue at some point, so the end of the fingerboard had discoloured through the glue soaking into it. There were some chips on the headstock, but all the machines were all okay. But significantly, the back of the neck had a split at the scarf joint, so that was the first thing that needed to be fixed. Here I'm just applying a little bit of weight just to open it up, and I've masked it off because I'm just going to soak it in water, and then let a very thin super glue soak into it, clamp it up, leave it, see how it goes. I saw this done on a YouTube video, first time I've ever tried such a thing, and it was successful. You can see there where I've slid some paper in. That's two pieces of paper, one each side at an angle, overlapping each other, showing you that this is a total separation of the glue joint. Now curiously, the guitar was still in tune, and it looked like somebody had been playing it like this, because there was a bit of dirt on the end of the piece of the scarf joint that you can see there, the point, had been slightly burred over and discoloured, so it had been played like it, I think. It was basically being held in place by the fingerboard and the end of the truss rod. It was free to just rock backwards and forwards. So squeeze in the super glue, clamp it up, leave it overnight, and from that I got a result. You can see just at the very top of this scarf joint where there's a little bit of discolouring. I didn't want to try and take that out because it was going to reshape the neck a bit too much. But other than that, it went together very, very well, and I tuned the guitar up and took it a tone up, 2 steps up, and left it like that for a day or so, and it was absolutely fine. And when it came to the finish on this guitar, before I'd even bothered to take anything off it, I just turned it over and attacked the back with a DA sander. And it was clearly basswood with very little figure and interest in it, and so whatever was going to happen, it was going to be a colour coat of some sort. The tribal, I don't know how these are put on. It's clearly a digital print, but I'm not sure what the actual transfer process is. But that certainly had to go. So I just sanded it all off with a dual action sander. But one of the things that I noted when I was just looking at the guitar in detail when I first got it was the bridge was sat right at the top of the post height, really. They were rocking on the very tops of the threads, on the very ends of the threads. And the neck angle was quite extreme, so I made an adjustment to the pocket and took a good 2 degrees out of it, which is quite a lot really, but that's what it needed to bring the bridge down so that the neck was arranged so that the line of the frets was dead on where the saddles were, so when the bridge was at its lowest position. So in other words, with strings on it, I could raise the bridge up at the very minimum amount to get my string height clearance. As you can see, there's very little interest in this figure. I did think originally of trying a candy colour over it, and I gave that a go to start with, but first off I wanted to just get this neck sorted out from the point of view of opening up the surface of the rosewood, and to do that I just simply gave it a scrape and flattened it and levelled it out. There were some grooves. This guitar had been played some bit, to be honest. Levelled them out as best able, just visually reasonable, and nothing was measured. Hardly relevant in my view when you just got frets that are actually the bits that matter. Everything cleaned up, the frets were levelled and polished, crowned, a whole bit. And the headstock, but this damage problem on the very end, in my view, would best be dealt with by simply cutting the damage off, and in my mind was to reduce the size of the headstock overall because it was quite a paddle really on the end of the neck. So what I did was slim the sides down as far as I could possibly go until they pretty much reached the tuners, and then the ends, the 2 horns as it were chopped down to take out the splits, and the whole thing tidied up very nicely as a result of that. So there's the splits that were removed, and that's the result after it's been fully finished. Much tidier, neater, smaller, more compact, better match for the size of the headstock to the body, I think, in my view. One of the things about the body when I was trial playing it was I found the contours quite uncomfortable for my style. So I simply penciled on some ideas of where I would like to bevel the edges of the top of the body and the back side as well, and just set to it with a chisel to get rid of the worst of it. And after the final shaping, it took on what I thought was a more attractive shape anyway. It minimises the size of the body a little bit, which is I think a bit of a bonus. Certainly practical. It's much more comfortable with the forearm across that top corner. And on the back side, it just needed a very much bigger scallop. So some quick pencil marks, and took that out with a power file and sanded. Much better, more comfortable. Back of the neck after it's had its final finish. Just showing the integrity of the joint there. That was, some time after, maybe weeks after it was originally done, so totally stable, no issues with it at all. And the front of the headstock, which I had to touch up the black a little bit, remasked the edge to tidy it up, and then just re-lacquer and maintain the original logo. And the body then went under a number of sealing coats, and then final lacquering to actually a final standard. And that is, for me, is the easiest way to start moving forward with colour coating, is you've got a totally solid sealed surface to work from. The first thing I did was put on what was bought as a black cherry candy. I wanted it to be quite opaque, with a very minimum amount of transparency remaining, but the problem with that was the grain was just not strong enough for it to be worth it, and it ended up being this curious bronzy red, one might call brown colour on some screens, and it wasn't any good. So I went back to basics and put a coat of quite a coarse metallic silver base coat on, and then with a mix of red cherry candy and black cherry candy, which is not applied evenly. It's actually fogged on in places to give a little bit more depth to the contours. Quite a coarse flake, as you can see. Worked out okay. I was happy with it. It looks nice in front of you, but it's a very difficult thing to photograph, to be honest with you. It's artificial light, it goes very red, and in daylight it goes more of this purple hues with this bronze thing going on around the corners. It's very nice. I'm very pleased with the way that came out. And there I am, evidence of the gloss finish. That was just one of those first polishes you do when the lacquer's still soft. Nice and easy to achieve that at that time. One of the things I wanted to do on this guitar was to sort the nut out with a 0 fret. I'm a fan of 0 frets, and this was a good opportunity to give it a go again. And so I took a piece of stainless steel, 6mm wide stainless steel, machined the bottom of it to a nice straight edge, and then marking the radius of the fingerboard onto the stainless steel. That was then dot marked, and I milled out a step to make a start into it, achieving that cutaway shape, and then finished it off with a little disc grinder to put the arc of the fingerboard into the underside of what would become the fret. Now, this step has to be there so that the centre line of the fret is on the very end of the fingerboard, so that it's in the correct position in respect to the intonation. So once that was trial fitted and a little bit of fiddling to get it to be a really good match to the top of the fingerboard, I then arched the top of the fret just crudely, and those holes are for screws, but they are to be considered to be more pins than screws. The holes that were drilled for them were only pilot hole at the very bottom of the screw hole, and the top of the screw hole was shank size. So the object is just to keep the nut firm whilst you're dressing the frets. That's its only purpose. So they're not trying to split open the fingerboard by going into the end grain at all. There it is after a brief levelling. I left it a little bit on top just for now, and crowned and polished it to a final shape. Now, to get a bit of brass to make the guide that would space the strings over the fret meant a bit of creativity. The only brass that I had was a little bit of hexagon bar that was just big enough for me to get a fairly standard Gibson-y sort of sized nut out. But of course in this case it's not a nut, it's a guide for the strings. Now the way I've set the slots up for the strings is that the top side of the slot for the E, A and D string and the bottom side of the slot are for the G, B and E string. So the string bears on one side of the slot, so it's that side of the slot that's in the correct position. The other side of the slot is just in open space. The string is not, the slots are not cut to string size. So if you look at that picture very closely, you'll see that the castellation that's in the centre, the lump that's between the two centre string slots, is very slightly narrower than the ones either side. That's because of the string being on one side on one slot and the other on the other. There it is in semi-finished condition. The plan has always been to get that brass nut chrome plated, but I've decided to just get on with that myself, and so I'm gathering the bits and pieces and chemicals that I need to do that a bit further down the road. But for now, that's a fully functional nut. Another component I made for this guitar to get around that problem with the wraparound bridge putting so much pressure onto those string post sockets, I made a tailpiece out of a piece of 3mm stainless steel. It was simply ground to shape and sanded and polished, and I slotted the string holes to retain the ball ends on the string. Ran a few trials on a couple of rough bits to make sure they could take the tension okay, and yep, worked out fine. That's how it sits on the instrument. It's been made to try and fit in with the overall design that the guitar has, such as it is. Whilst I was at it, I wanted a display stand for this guitar, so I made this, which is I describe it as having a sort of an oriental feel to it really. It's a satin black hardwood stand made from sections of beech and oak, and it's dedicated to this instrument. It's been made to fit that neck alone really. Others will go in it, but it's quite wide up on that one on the BC Rich, so it's for that purpose, and that's where it's going to sit in the front room. And there's the finished instrument. The other bits I've added here are a replacement bridge, which was just of the same quality that was on there. Poor, but it looked okay. The pickup surrounds are excellent things, really nice die castings, very well polished and chrome plated. They were an eBay purchase in the UK, very nice. The original knobs and the original switch were all okay. The only thing that's outstanding on these pictures of the finished guitar are the chroming of the nut, because that's the only bit of brass that's visible, and it just doesn't look right in my view. Here you can see some of the slight fogging that went on with the candies, how it was distributed a little bit oddly, just to add a bit of surface profile to it. Daylight, again, changing this colour of the body significantly. Most of these pictures taken at the very end use daylight, including the ones that were taken inside the house, because it makes such a difference to the way the colour looks. There's the nut doing its thing. You see how the strings work through the guide slots. No issues with vibrations, and tuning is an absolute joy. It just moves through there so smoothly, no problems whatsoever, no pinging, nothing grabs, and the action down at the bottom of the fingerboard, because of a 0 fret usage, is just superb. And there's no difference in the sound between a fretted note and the open string. The whole point of using 0 frets has been realised with this one, so I'm very pleased with that. There we are, the BC Rich Warlock. Another project I'd started some time ago was a fretless bass. I wanted to make a short scale in particular, and I was actually at a guy's place picking up some pickups, and we were chatting about this idea of making a short scale fretless, and he mentioned he happened to have a second-hand neck, which after a quick look proved to be an ideal candidate for defretting and using the cyano process on it to put a finish onto the board. So I did that work first and resulted in this, which was quite pleasing. It's a very unusual fingerboard material. I've got no idea what it was. I can only describe it as a grey colour, almost blue, almost a steel blue colour. It was suggested by the guy that sold it to me that it might be roasted maple, but I'm not so sure. Either way, when it was being worked on, the dust that came off it did have a kind of a sooty sense to it. It was really weird, but it gave me a really nice dark fingerboard, which is exactly what I wanted. My edge markings that I've used on previous fretless guitars worked very well on it. So I'd had this kicking around for probably 2 or 3 months, just waiting really to get a body to transfer it onto. And of course a period of being at home meant that I might have the time to do such a thing, but what materials? Well, some time ago I'd picked up an old oak dining table. It's not an antique table, it was something that's solid oak for sure, but it was, it had this false antiquing on it with sprayed fading and, simulated wormholes even. It was a bit of pastiche furniture really, but a nice piece of old oak. Now I know some tonewood aficionados would have a few views on the use of oak, but I have no time for you guys. I'm just going to move on. What I needed to do was to separate the planks that this was made from so I could control where the joints were. And for this particular project I used the 2 side leaves off the table. I still have the main section for future projects, but the 2 leaves laminated together gave me a suitable sort of thickness for a bass body. So the first thing that I needed to do was to make some clearances on a centre section, which would be the neck pickup bridge area. And the reason I did it in pieces like this was I was able to fit the pieces of wood into a milling machine, which meant I could get the accuracy that I needed very, very easily. And it saved me an awful lot of work trying to make jigs for routers, etc. So it was kind of a piecemeal construction of the body based around this central spine of the neck socket, the pickups and the bridge. Once I'd measured all the pickups, I routed those out again on the milling machine. Very, very simple process there. Every single component that was then laminated together was then edge treated. I just made up a shooting board here and used the old method of doing an edge, and the piece that joined it you invert and do that edge and you get an exact match. And there you can see from the that particular cut the medullary rays that are in oak. Very, very evident of it being a classic oak. The guitar body was made up of 2 laminations of 3 jointed sections. So here's the top, centre and the 2 wings either side being cramped up. And once I'd repeated that with the underside as well, I then traced around an existing bass I quite liked, which was a Tanglewood Rebel 4K. I like the body shape. I had to modify it significantly though to make it work for 2 reasons. First off, my neck socket couldn't be the same as the one that they'd used. Very different design. And significantly, because it was a full-scale 2-octave neck on the original Tanglewood, the neck socket relationship to the distance to the bridge was radically different to maintain the correct scale lengths. So I had to add a good inch and a quarter to the back of the body to be able to move the bridge far enough away. I then positioned the pickups with the front one, the neck pickup, being pretty much where you'd expect it to be on a jazz style pickup such as these are. But on the bridge one, I've sized it so that it's closer to the bridge than it normally would be. But that's because I've got a wish to put in a humbucker in there with a double jazz bass style. So coming towards the neck with the extension on that router cut will allow me to do that. But for now, this was, again, using pickups that I had around me at the time. To join the two parts together, by the way, these were cut out by simply jigsawing, and then I used a drum sounder to complete the edges, used the top one to mark the bottom one, and then matched them up after the gluing process, which I aided by using this classic pin method to make sure they don't slide around. Cramped them all up, and then once finished, I had quite a respectable looking, I think, solid oak laminate body. The back of it needed to be cleared out for a control cavity, again back onto the milling machine, because it was down the bottom of the body. I could fit it on my little machine, okay. And on this guitar, I wanted to try the idea of using a Strat style socket for the output, so I could keep the output socket behind the instrument, something I'd tried years ago, and from memory I think that's pretty much where it should be, so giving that a go. I then radiused the top face and added a bevel to the back for a little bit of clearance down the bottom horn and for the waist clearance there. First thing I did, and this was always in my mind in respect to finishing it for the sake of speed, was to just do a black stain and wax or otherwise seal it to give me an open grain satin finish. I did that. This was the first coat of stain, and in rubbing it down, some rather nice figure started coming through. So what I've done for now is compromise between the two. I've left the figure on the front of the instrument, and where all the end grain is around the sides and the back have been left in the satin, and I'm happy for that for now. I can change it if I want to very, very easily. This is just a wipe-on process, so at least that way I've not burnt any bridges. I can do it later on if I choose. Needed to make up a couple of strap buttons, so a simple turning job. The one on the right here has been scalloped, so it shapes into the horn, so it fits really snugly. I needed a string retainer, didn't have anything in black, so as it happened I took a piece off one of my machines that I never use, which was a stop bar, and used that as a piece of material to make myself a string retainer. And I used a chemical blacking process to put the black finish on it. This is like a gun finishing process. And the completed instrument, as you can see, it's a 6-bolt neck plate. I really like that idea. Gives a very, very firm neck without having stressed screws. I put the name Lockdown 2020 and my surname on it, just for a bit of posterity, I guess. Flat wound strings, giving those a go, and overall I've ended up with a nice instrument to play with. I'm still not sure about the flat wounds. It has a very unique sound, which at some point in another video I will show you guys, but it's working and it's nice and easy to play, nice and simple. And it cost me nothing more than the set of strings, which I ordered when I started on the Monday, and this guitar was finished the following Sunday, by which time the strings had arrived. Nice and easy. But on to the second lockdown project. I've always been a fan of the shape of the Gibson Explorer. So it would be nice to have another one, I thought. So I happen to have a guitar in which I'd bought as a fixer-upper project, which is a part of a beginner kit that Marshall Amplification put together. It's a pretty basic instrument, but like a lot of these Far East instruments, it's got everything there, and if you put a bit of application into it, it can be made into a perfectly legit thing to use. But this one needed a bit of help in respect to its finish. It had some damage on the body and was a bit scruffy. But there I had a neck with a headstock that was in the right sort of place to be a nice shape to use on an Explorer. So first thing I did was get a hold of a set of drawings off the net, which was dead easy, of the original 58 Explorer from Gibson. And the piece of material that I needed to, or wanted to use for this, was not going to be able to allow me to get a full-size body out. And I didn't actually think it was that bad a thing to just chop the body size down a little bit anyway. So all in all, I lost a couple of inches, about just over 50 mil, off the body length by scaling it down, just using simple CAD software. This is Corel as a graphics package more than anything, and resulted in this as the primary outline, with the significant elements of a Fender style scale length, which means the bridge position looks a little bit further back than it would have, coupled with a slightly smaller body. And of course the neck socket arrangement was entirely an ST style arrangement. So I modded those drawings to morph the two together and use those to simply print onto paper templates and use those to cut the patterns out, which we'll come to. So this is one of the pieces of material that I wanted to use, which is a book-matched bird's eye flame maple bed headboard. I've got a few boards from a piece of bedroom furniture, and this is on 18mm plywood. Tonewood aficionados, goodbye. There's always going to be controversial such things, but with this kind of instruments and this kind of application, means nothing. So happy to use this, but at 18mm plus the veneer, and the veneer was 25 thou I could measure in places. It was paper thin. I needed to make up a significant amount on the thickness of the body. My workbench in the workshop used to be our dining table, and the end of it stuck out a bit, and so that doesn't anymore. That was 1mm thicker than the total thickness that I needed to match the original Gibson spec, so perfect. It's actually rubber. This is rubber tree wood, small sections which use these lovely comb joints to make them into usable hardwood lumps, which is a good thing. Ecologically friendly timber usage, it's good stuff. Other scraps that I had left over from the base that I'd just been talking about were used to join together to make a router template. I made the template in a milling machine in the same manner that I used the milling machine for the base, and troweled a few cutouts on a piece of timber, and everything was okay. Slight difference between the template drawing of the radius on the heel of the neck, but happy to live with that, because the Marshall neck doesn't quite match it to the millimetre, but I'm going to leave it like it because I will be putting the Marshall back together at some point and replacing this neck, so I'm going to leave that as it is. Trial fit of the pickups, all fitted snugly, nice and straight, easy to achieve on a milling machine. Having printed the CAD drawing out on 1:1 scale on a pen plotter I have, that was simply laid onto the timbers, knifed out to mark. I then jigsawed the blanks out and used a drum sander to get the bulk down, and block sanding with right angle blocks to keep things nice and true. I finally finished the outside of the main bottom section made from the dining table, and used that to mark out the top section with the veneer on it, and left that roughly cut oversize until after they'd been bonded. Before they went together, I routed with a hand router some channels for the signal cables from the pickups and for the earth for the bridge, and then clamped the two parts together. Now the original plan was to use a classic laminate trimmer, but the veneer really didn't like this. It didn't matter whether I used climbing cuts or not, it would not stick the impact of the router even with the lightest of touches. So the way to actually fix that was to laminate a piece of wood on top, but I figured it would just be easier to just use the drum sander and just match it that way. So with the router guide to take out the pickup and the neck socket, with the guide clamped down on top of the guitar and the veneer didn't split out, so no problems with that part of the process. Then back onto the milling machine again. This corner could fit onto the milling machine okay, so take out the control cavity, and the same idea with the socket, using a Stratocaster style output socket, but I'll say now that's not in the right place. It didn't work out. I'm going to be changing that, but that's where we are when we went through it. You can see the undercut that's been put in onto the output socket on the left there. So there's a remainder for the screw to fit into, but the tangs from the socket itself are clear. That's a nice easy thing to achieve on a milling machine. Now the original Marshall body was slightly thinner than the Gibson spec body, so I needed to recess the neck plate a little bit to get it to the right height so the screw lengths were correct. The simplest way to do it, again, you could have got better screws, but then spirit of the occasion. I wanted to change the name on the headstock, so the idea was to use a metallic silver logo, Marshall, such as is actually the make of the guitar. And the issue with using metallic for spray painting or even brush painting is that when you rub it down to put further coats on, or clear or something like that, you damage the metallic. So the way to do this is to put the metallic down first. So that's a base coat with a clear lacquer, and that's just been done a day or so before I needed to get the sign writing done. So we'll come back to that. Because of the ply edge and the thin veneer, we needed to bind the edge of this, and I've never bound a guitar, never done any binding, so this was a first go for me. The only material that I had around me was a lump of walnut, which was originally a target rifle gun stock blank, and my circular saw could just manage, that plank is 60mm wide, I could just get through that with my skill saw. And I cut it down to 7mm thick by 60 by, it was about, I don't know, maybe 600 long, something like that. And then that was stripped down on a little table saw to 2.5mm width strips, and they were left soaking in water overnight for me to carry out the bending operations. Whilst the router table was set up like it was, I popped in a profile cutter to put the radius onto the back, nice and simply. I think that's all it needs for me for comfort. The front I was very nervous about putting the rebate in for the binding. Once I'd experienced those issues with the trimmer, trying to get the two body profile to match. But for reasons unknown, this didn't give me any problems whatsoever. Again, I assured climbing cuts, and everything was fine, no issues. Got nice clean edges. The binding itself, the soaked walnut strips, were steam bent and then clamped to the guitar body and left to dry in the sun to make sure that they retained those shape for gluing. This particular bend was very, very difficult. I had to try that maybe 4 or 5 times before you happened to have a piece of wood where the way the grain was arranged would not fracture on the tight bend. Having applied all the bindings, these were cyanoed into place. I flatted it all down and gave it a quick coat of protective clear coat so I could move on to start working on the back of the guitar, starting to look nice. So here's the headstock now finished. So all I did was mask off the Marshall with some airbrush masking film, and then sprayed the black in a very thin coat. Removed the masking film and without rubbing anything down, applied a coat of lacquer, and then you flat that once it's cured and re-lacquer that to get a nice level surface with no rays around the lettering whatsoever. The body now has received its final clear coat on the front, bar the very last overall coat, and the back of the instrument, to cover up the plywood edges, end grain, etc. I simply used an automotive 2-pack primer filler. Wonderful stuff, cures really, really quickly and has excellent filling properties and very stable. This was given a coat of black, which is the only colour I had that was really suitable. I can't think of much else that you could use, to be honest. And then the whole thing was lacquered, which left us with a guitar ready to put together, and this was the result, which I have to say I'm very pleased with. It sounds really, really nice. It looks elegant, looks the part. One issue I've had is whether I do or do not fit a scratch plate. And so what I've decided to do there is actually have a removable one. So I really need a scratch plate for my playing. So whilst it's hanging and being looked at, the plate is off, and a couple of simple hidden magnets, so there's no visual difference to the instrument when the plate's off, hold the plate in place. And that gives me the solution I need for that one. So there you go. 3 projects, all in the space of 3 weeks of this period we've had to spend at home during the COVID-19 lockdown. At some point over the next few weeks I'll put together some kind of a musical thing with my quality of playing to show you how these 3 instruments sound like together in some piece or other. I'll see you then.